Hey guys, tonight we begin with a question that sounds surprisingly simple. What did people in the Middle Ages actually consider beautiful? Because if you've ever looked at a medieval painting and quietly wondered why everyone seems slightly uncomfortable, congratulations. You're asking the same question historians have been asking for generations. So tonight, dim the lights, get comfortable. Maybe grab a blanket that isn't woven from scratchy sheep wool by your aunt who has been spinning thread since sunrise. Take a slow breath, and let's drift into a world where pale skin was worth more than expensive jewellery. Eyebrows occasionally vanished on purpose. Bathing was not quite the disaster modern movies pretend it was. And an ideal forehead could become so enormous that people willingly plucked their own hairline backward. Because apparently, fashion has always contained at least a little bit of collective madness. As always, settle in, relax, and let history do all the work while you simply listen. Beauty is one of those things every society insists is completely obvious. Until you travel a few hundred years into the past, then suddenly everything changes. The features considered breathtaking in one century become unfortunate in the next. The hairstyle everyone copies eventually becomes proof that your family has absolutely no taste whatsoever. And somewhere, a poor noblewoman spends 2 hours removing perfectly healthy eyebrows because somebody at court declared foreheads should resemble polished dinner plates. Human beings have always been wonderfully committed to making life more complicated than necessary. The medieval world stretched across nearly 1,000 years, from roughly the 5th century until the late 15th. That is an enormous amount of time, almost as long as waiting for certain royal succession disputes to finally end. So there was never one universal medieval beauty standard. England looked different from France. France looked different from Italy. Italy constantly insisted everyone else was doing everything incorrectly. Meanwhile, Scandinavia was simply trying to survive another winter. Yet certain ideas appeared again and again. One of the biggest was pale skin. Today, many people spend vacations hoping to return home with a deep tan. Medieval elites would have looked at that tan with genuine concern. Not because they disliked sunlight, because sunlight suggested labour. If your skin had become dark from working outdoors, people assumed you spent your days farming, carrying wood, harvesting grain, tending animals, or doing any number of exhausting jobs. All perfectly respectable work, but not aristocratic work. The nobility wanted their appearance to announce something before they even spoke. My family owns the fields. We do not personally dig them. Pale skin became a visible symbol of wealth, not unlike luxury watches today. Except instead of checking the time, your face quietly informed everyone that someone else handled the manual labour. This preference existed in many societies throughout history. In medieval Europe, it became almost obsessive. Ladies carried parasols. They wore veils. Wide hats appeared. Long sleeves covered arms. Walking outside during the brightest hours could be carefully managed, not because ultraviolet rays were understood scientifically, but because appearances mattered a great deal. Medical writers even connected complexion with personality, healthy balance, moral character, good breeding. The body was believed to reflect the soul in surprisingly literal ways. If someone
appeared physically harmonious, perhaps God had also granted them inner harmony. Simple, convenient, not always accurate. History offers countless attractive people who behaved like absolute disasters, and plenty of ordinary-looking individuals who quietly held kingdoms together while everyone else argued. Still, appearance remained powerful, especially at court. A royal court was not simply government, it was theatre. Every entrance, every gown, every hairstyle, every jewel, every gesture communicated status. People watched constantly. One wrong fashion choice could become conversation for weeks, which sounds exhausting. It probably was. Imagine breakfast with 200 nobles, carefully pretending not to stare, while absolutely staring. That was court life. Hair itself carried enormous symbolic weight. Long hair was usually admired in women. It suggested youth, health, fertility, gentle upbringing. Paintings often show flowing golden hair cascading down shoulders. Reality, of course, was more complicated. Hair had to be cleaned, protected, braided, covered. Married women frequently concealed most of it beneath veils, wimples, or elaborate head coverings. Ironically, beautiful hair often spent most of its existence hidden from public view. Fashion has always loved contradiction. Young, unmarried women might display luxurious hair more openly. Marriage often changed everything. Covering one's hair communicated modesty, religious devotion, respectability. Again, beauty and morality frequently became intertwined. The ideal woman was not merely attractive, she was modestly attractive, gracefully attractive, appropriately attractive. Attractive without appearing to know she was attractive, which is a remarkably difficult balancing act. Men faced their own expectations. Contrary to popular imagination, medieval noblemen cared deeply about appearance. Clothing signalled rank. Well-maintained beards or clean-shaven faces shifted with changing fashion. Hair length varied over centuries. Some periods admired longer curls, others preferred neater styles. A knight arriving with dirty clothing or neglected grooming risked appearing careless rather than heroic. Chivalry involved presentation, not just swordplay, although poets certainly spent more time praising perfect curls than discussing laundry schedules. Faces also mattered. Symmetry attracted admiration. Clear skin suggested health. Bright eyes appeared lively. Small mouths were often praised in women. Delicate noses appeared repeatedly in descriptions of noble beauty. Yet artists rarely aimed for photographic realism. Portraits reflected ideals as much as actual faces. Think of them as medieval social media filters, only involving egg tempera instead of smartphone software. One fascinating trend involved foreheads. Exceptionally high foreheads became fashionable during parts of the later Middle Ages. Women sometimes plucked hair along the front of the scalp. Some removed eyebrows almost entirely.
Others thinned them dramatically. The result emphasized a smooth, expansive forehead. Modern viewers occasionally assume portraits simply exaggerate. Not always. People genuinely altered themselves to achieve the look. Which raises an obvious question. Why? Several explanations exist. Some scholars connect it to ideas about intelligence and refinement. A broad forehead suggested nobility. Others point toward artistic conventions spreading through elite circles. Fashion rarely needs perfectly logical explanations. Sometimes enough influential people simply decide something looks elegant. Then everyone else follows, until the next generation laughs at.
The cycle continues forever. Cosmetics existed too, despite assumptions that medieval people ignored personal grooming. Recipes circulated for skin creams, perfumes, hair treatments, tooth cleaning mixtures, breath fresheners. Complex beauty manuals appeared among educated elites. Ingredients ranged from familiar herbs to substances modern dermatologists would politely describe as deeply concerning. Lead-based cosmetics occasionally appeared. They created wonderfully pale complexions. They also slowly poisoned users. A rather unfortunate trade-off. Looking radiant today, feeling terrible tomorrow. History is filled with beauty routines that should absolutely remain historical. Perfume held particular importance. Cities smelled energetic. Animals, smoke, open markets, leather workshops, fish, people, more people. Even wealthy homes shared the aromas of fireplaces, cooking, candles, rushes on floors, damp stone walls, and countless other scents. Pleasant fragrances, therefore, became extremely desirable. Rose water, lavender, herbs, imported spices. These transformed both bodies and rooms. Sweet smells suggested refinement, civilization, status.
The wealthy surrounded themselves with pleasant scents whenever possible. Even gloves could be perfumed. Imagine shaking hands and smelling roses instead of horses. Progress comes in many forms. Clothing itself became an extension of beauty. Fine wool, silk imported through expensive trade routes, velvet, fur, embroidery. Rich colours required costly dyes.
Bright scarlet, deep blue. Certain shades practically announced enormous wealth. Especially blue produced using expensive techniques. Colour functioned almost like modern designer labels. Without saying a word, clothing revealed financial power. Naturally, governments occasionally became nervous. Sumptuary laws attempted to regulate who could wear certain fabrics, furs, jewels, and colours. The idea sounded straightforward. If everyone dressed according to rank, society remained orderly. Reality proved more complicated. People ignored the rules, found loopholes, borrowed clothing, inherited garments, or simply decided looking magnificent outweighed paying the occasional fine. Human beings have always demonstrated remarkable creativity whenever fashion restrictions appear. Shoes developed their own strange journey. Some noblemen wore astonishingly long pointed shoes known today as poulaines. The toes extended dramatically forward, sometimes absurdly so. Walking became interesting. Extra long points occasionally required supports. Yes, history genuinely reached a point where footwear needed structural engineering because fashion had become over-enthusiastic. Apparently, ordinary shoes simply lacked sufficient theatrical commitment. Meanwhile, ideal body shape differed considerably from modern expectations. Thinness alone was rarely celebrated. Extreme muscularity wasn't either. Moderate softness often suggested prosperity. Enough food, good health, security. The wealthy could afford regular meals. The poor often could not. A comfortably nourished appearance therefore communicated privilege. Naturally, there were limits. Poets praised graceful figures, balanced proportions, elegant movement. Not excessive weight, nor visible hunger. Finding the exact fashionable middle has always been humanity's favourite impossible assignment. Medical theory influenced beauty more than we sometimes realise. Most educated Europeans accepted the ancient concept of the four humours: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, black bile. Health depended upon their balance. Physical appearance supposedly reflected these invisible internal conditions. Beauty, therefore, wasn't entirely cosmetic. It hinted at proper bodily harmony. A glowing complexion, bright eyes, good posture, calm demeanour. These all suggested internal balance.
Whether they actually proved anything medically is another question entirely, but people sincerely believed they mattered. The Church added another layer. Christian teaching praised modesty. Vanity could become sinful if taken too far, yet beautiful churches celebrated artistic splendour. Kings dressed magnificently. Queens wore jewels.
Religious festivals featured elaborate ceremonial clothing. The line between appreciating beauty and indulging vanity constantly shifted. Many medieval people navigated this tension throughout their lives. A noble woman might spend hours preparing elegant clothing, then donate generously to monasteries. A bishop could criticize excessive luxury while wearing beautifully crafted ceremonial robes. Humans have always excelled at holding complicated, occasionally contradictory beliefs. And perhaps that is one of the most familiar parts of medieval life. Not the hairstyles, not the foreheads, not the pointed shoes, but the endless balancing act between who people were, who they wished to appear to be, and who society expected them to become. It is a quiet theme that will follow us through tonight's journey.
Because beauty was never only about beauty. It was about power, family, faith, marriage, money, status, and the surprisingly exhausting effort of convincing everyone else that you belonged exactly where you stood. So, while one noble woman carefully plucked another tiny row of hairs from her forehead, somewhere nearby, another court poet was almost certainly preparing several overly dramatic verses comparing her complexion to lilies, ivory, moonlight, fresh cream, polished marble,
and every other pale object he could possibly think of. Poets have always been wonderfully committed to exaggeration. Unfortunately for us, they left behind enough descriptions that we can still wander quietly through their curious world. One very sleepy beauty standard at a time. Bathing, teeth, hair, and the surprisingly high-maintenance medieval morning. When people imagine medieval Europe, they often picture an entire continent that collectively decided bathing was an unnecessary hobby. Everyone supposedly wandered around permanently covered in mud. Nobody owned a comb. Soap had apparently not yet been invented. And every room smelt like damp sheep and regret. Like many popular ideas about the Middle Ages, this one survives because it is simple. Reality, naturally, refuses to cooperate. So let's quietly wander into the medieval bathroom. Well, perhaps bathroom is being a little generous. More like a corner of the house with a wooden tub, several buckets, and someone already complaining about how much firewood it takes to heat water. A hot bath was expensive, not because water itself was rare. Water was everywhere. The problem was heating enough of it.
Every bucket had to be carried. Every fire had to be built. Every log had to be chopped. Someone had to do all that work. And surprisingly, that someone was rarely the nobleman currently writing poems about someone's elegant neck. People certainly washed. They simply didn't always soak in enormous steaming tubs every morning, the way modern advertisements encourage. Daily routines often involved
washing the face, the hands, sometimes the neck, perhaps the feet. These smaller washings required much less effort. Cleanliness mattered, especially before meals. After all, people usually ate with their hands. Nobody particularly wanted yesterday's stable lingering beneath their fingernails while reaching for dinner. Even medieval etiquette books quietly agreed on that point. Large public bathhouses existed in many medieval towns. This tends to surprise people. In parts of Germany, France, Italy, and England, bathhouses could be lively places. Men and women sometimes bathed separately, sometimes together, depending on the region, depending on local customs, and depending on whether church authorities happened to be particularly enthusiastic about discouraging mixed bathing that decade. Opinions shifted frequently. Some bathhouses offered food, music, massages, conversation. They were part social club, part relaxation, part hygiene. Occasionally they gained rather questionable reputations, because whenever humans create buildings where warm water and privacy exist together, someone inevitably complicates things. Municipal governments regularly issued regulations. Church leaders occasionally frowned, then tolerated them, then frowned again. History enjoys repeating itself. Disease also shaped bathing habits. After the great outbreaks of plague, some physicians began worrying that very hot baths opened the pores too much. The theory suggested dangerous air could then enter the body. Today, we understand disease differently, but medieval medicine relied on observations filtered through older theories. If people noticed someone became sick after visiting crowded bathhouses, they naturally searched for explanations. Not all of those explanations happened to be correct. Still, they were trying to understand an invisible world without microscopes, which is a remarkably difficult assignment. Soap itself certainly existed. People produced it using animal fat, wood ash, plant oils.
Different regions favoured different recipes. Some soaps were coarse, others surprisingly refined. Mediterranean areas benefited from olive oil production. Northern Europe often relied more heavily on animal fats. Nobody was browsing 37 scented varieties labelled Ocean Breeze, but cleaning agents absolutely existed. Clothing, interestingly enough, received enormous attention. People might not bathe every single day, yet fresh linen worn beneath outer garments helped absorb sweat. Changing underclothes
clothes mattered. Laundry mattered. Clean fabric against the skin could make someone feel considerably cleaner, even if they had not enjoyed
a luxurious bath that week. The medieval wardrobe quietly did much of the work modern people expect from showers. It wasn't perfect, but it wasn't primitive ignorance either. Hair required constant attention. Long hair tangled, collected dust, caught tiny visitors no one invited. Combs, therefore, became essential. Archaeologists regularly uncover beautifully carved combs made from bone, wood, horn, ivory. Some were practical, others remarkably elegant. Personal grooming happened daily in many households. Ladies brushed long hair carefully. Servants assisted noblewomen. Braids protected hair during work.
Head coverings shielded it from dirt. Hair oil occasionally improved texture. Rose water added pleasant fragrance. There was far more maintenance than popular culture usually admits. Lice, unfortunately, remained common companions. Not because people were unusually dirty, simply because lice are astonishingly good at surviving wherever humans gather. Schools still discover them today, despite indoor plumbing, shampoo, and internet access. Some things apparently refuse retirement. Medieval combs often featured very fine teeth specifically designed to remove unwanted insects. A practical solution. Quietly effective. Nobody wrote romantic poetry about it.
But daily life often depends upon unromantic details. Now, let's gently glide toward everyone's favourite dental topic: teeth. Hollywood has convinced many people that medieval mouths resembled abandoned castle ruins. A few lonely survivors leaning in random directions. The occasional dramatic gap. General despair. Reality again proves more interesting. Medieval people cared about their teeth. Medical books recommended cleaning them. Various powders appeared. Ground charcoal, salt, herbs, burned rosemary, mint, sage, even cloth rubbed across the teeth after meals.
Toothbrushes, as we know them, did not yet exist. But cleaning certainly did. Dental health varied enormously depending upon diet. The wealthy enjoyed more sugar than ordinary villagers. Imported sugar remained expensive, but honey, sweet pastries, candied fruits, these slowly became more common among elites. Ironically, wealth occasionally produced worse teeth. Meanwhile, many peasants consumed coarse bread containing tiny particles from grinding stones. These microscopic bits gradually wore teeth down through decades of chewing. Imagine every loaf containing a whisper of... Not ideal. Still,
Many medieval skeletons reveal surprisingly healthy teeth compared with people living centuries later after refined sugar became widespread. The dentist, however, well, nobody eagerly anticipated that appointment. Dental procedures existed. They were memorable. Let's leave it there. Breath also mattered. Nobody enjoys close conversation with someone whose lunch continues participating several hours later. Herbal breath fresheners appeared frequently. Parsley, mint, anise, cloves. People chewed aromatic plants. Some recipes instructed readers to rinse the mouth with wine mixed alongside fragrant herbs. Expensive, perhaps, but considerably more pleasant than garlic lingering through an entire royal banquet. Now, imagine preparing for a feast at a great noble household. Servants bustle quietly through long corridors. Candles flicker. Clothing hangs neatly arranged. Jewellery waits upon polished tables. Our noblewoman begins hours before dinner. Her hair is carefully brushed, perhaps lightly perfumed. She washes her hands, her face. Fresh linen replaces yesterday's. A servant helps lace her gown. Another adjusts sleeves. Jewels follow, then the veil, or perhaps an elaborate headdress, depending upon fashion. Nothing happens quickly. Everything communicates rank. Even standing still becomes performance. Meanwhile, her husband eventually remembers he should probably change clothes as well. Some traditions truly are timeless. Men also devoted attention to appearance. Beards came and went according to fashion. Certain kings preferred magnificent facial hair. Others embraced smooth faces. Barbers became respected professionals. They trimmed hair, shaved customers, sometimes performed minor surgical procedures. Yes, the same individual might shave your beard and remove a troublesome growth later that afternoon. Professional specialization still had room to grow. Barber surgeons displayed striped poles outside their shops. The familiar red and white barber pole seen today traces distant roots back toward those medieval medical traditions. History enjoys hiding itself inside ordinary objects. Mirrors, however, remained relatively uncommon. Polished metal served many households. Silver, bronze, sometimes steel. Glass mirrors existed, but remained costly. Many people simply knew their own appearance less precisely than modern individuals. Checking smartphones 15 times before lunch. Imagine living without endless photographs, without selfies, without front-facing cameras. Most people encountered their reflection only occasionally, perhaps in polished metal, still water, or a fine mirror owned by someone wealthier than themselves. It encouraged a different relationship with personal appearance. You relied partly upon what others told you. Friends, family, servants, tailors. Everyone collectively participated in presenting your public image. Beauty, therefore, became slightly more communal. Scent deserves another quiet visit. Perfume did more than disguise unpleasant odours. Fragrance carried emotional meaning. Rose suggested refinement. Lavender conveyed freshness. Imported spices hinted at tremendous wealth. Ambergris, musk, frankincense. These exotic materials travelled astonishing distances before reaching European courts. Imagine carrying the scent of trade routes stretching across continents. A single perfume bottle quietly announced global commerce. Religious life also influenced grooming. Monks often shaved the tops of their heads in the famous tonsure. This hairstyle symbolized humility, obedience, devotion, although practical benefits existed too. Less hair required less maintenance. Some monks were undoubtedly grateful for that. Others, perhaps, privately missed fashionable curls. Human nature rarely disappears merely because someone joins a monastery. Nuns covered their hair almost completely. Again, modesty shaped appearance. Religious clothing intentionally minimized vanity, at least in theory. In practice, wealthier convents occasionally possessed beautifully made garments, despite their simplicity. Fine craftsmanship and humble intention could coexist, not always comfortably, but they tried. Children experienced grooming rather differently. Young boys and girls often wore simple clothing. Haircuts remained practical. As they approached adulthood, appearance increasingly reflected family ambitions. A noble daughter's hairstyle suddenly mattered because marriage negotiations approached. A young nobleman's clothing signalled future responsibilities. Growing up meant gradually becoming a walking advertisement for one's lineage. No pressure. Cosmetics continued evolving throughout these centuries. Women used herbal preparations, hoping to soften skin, reduce blemishes, lighten freckles. Recipes circulated enthusiastically. Some worked reasonably well. Others almost certainly accomplished nothing beyond emptying someone's purse. Beauty industries have maintained remarkable consistency over the centuries. There is always another miracle cream, always another secret formula, always another merchant confidently promising astonishing transformation. Some habits never retire. Sunlight remained the great enemy of fashionable pale skin. Ladies walked beneath parasols, veils shaded faces, wide hats helped. Outdoor work threatened elite appearance. Even farmers understood this difference.
A deeply tanned face often reflected honest labour. A pale complexion quietly announced leisure. Status literally became visible upon the skin. It is fascinating how something modern vacation brochures celebrate would once have suggested entirely different social circumstances. History constantly rearranges the meaning of ordinary things. Perhaps the greatest misconception surrounding medieval beauty is that people somehow stopped caring. Nothing could be further from reality. People admired elegance. They noticed clothing, complimented hairstyles, judged posture, discussed complexion, envied expensive fabrics, compared neighbours, complained about changing fashions, grumbled that young people dressed strangely nowadays. Parents have apparently delivered that exact speech for at least 800 years. Some traditions deserve medals for endurance. So, when we picture medieval life, perhaps we should replace the image of universally filthy castles filled with people indifferent to appearance. Instead, imagine individuals doing the very human thing every generation has done. Trying to look respectable, trying to impress neighbours, trying to appear wealthier, healthier, younger, more sophisticated, trying to keep up with fashions that changed just quickly enough to become inconvenient, and quietly hoping nobody noticed that yesterday's expensive imported perfume had mostly faded by lunchtime. Because even 600 years ago, looking effortlessly elegant usually required an astonishing amount of effort. And, as we'll soon discover, nothing displayed that effort more dramatically than clothing itself. A world where sleeves became political statements, hats reached improbable heights, and one fashionable shoe could cost nearly as much as an ordinary family's yearly income. Dressing like medieval royalty, or at least looking rich enough to avoid carrying firewood. By now, we've quietly wandered through medieval ideas of beautiful faces. We've admired impossibly pale skin. We've survived the great forehead expansion. We've discovered that medieval people owned combs, soap, and enough perfume to make a rose garden slightly nervous. Now let's open the wardrobe. Not literally. If this belonged to a medieval duchess, it would probably require 3 servants, 2 heavy keys, and someone whose official job title translated roughly as keeper of expensive fabric. Clothing in the Middle Ages was never just clothing. It was biography. A single glance told strangers where you belonged, or at least where you desperately hoped they believed you belonged. Long before business cards, resumes, or social media profiles, your wardrobe quietly introduced you. It whispered your family's wealth, your profession, your marital status, sometimes your political loyalties, occasionally even your moral character. Quite a lot for one dress to handle. For ordinary villagers, clothes had one very straightforward purpose: stay warm, stay dry,
last as long as possible.
Wool dominated everyday life. Sheep were everywhere. They produced reliable fibre. Wool remained warm even when damp, which was extremely useful in climates that seemed permanently committed to producing rain. Linen formed another essential fabric. Made from flax, linen became shirts, undergarments, towels, sleeping garments, and countless household items. Soft linen against the skin felt wonderfully comfortable compared with rough outer wool. Silk, however, silk belonged to another universe. Silk travelled astonishing distances, from Asia, through merchants, across dangerous trade routes, over mountains, across seas, through countless hands before finally arriving in European courts. Every inch represented wealth, not because silk possessed magical properties, but because transporting it halfway across the known world required enormous resources. Imagine buying a shirt today that had travelled across continents by camel, ship, mule, riverboat, and wagon. It would probably be expensive. Medieval silk certainly was. Velvet carried similar prestige. Its soft surface reflected light beautifully. Deep colours shimmered differently depending upon movement. Walking through a candle-lit hall wearing crimson velvet must have felt rather magnificent. Not that anyone admitted enjoying admiration too much. That might have sounded vain. Better to appear modest, while coincidentally wearing enough luxury fabric to purchase several farms. Nobility became remarkably skilled at this balancing act. Colour mattered almost as much as material. Today, almost anyone can wear bright blue. Simply visit a clothing store. Problem solved. In the medieval world, certain colours required rare dyes. Blue often came from woad in northern Europe, or for especially luxurious shades, imported materials like lapis lazuli in artistic contexts. Rich scarlet demanded expensive dye sources. Deep purple retained echoes of ancient imperial traditions. Black, interestingly enough, eventually became one of the most expensive colours to produce properly. A rich, even black required repeated dyeing. Poorly dyed black often faded into disappointing shades of brown. Wealthy merchants and nobles therefore proudly displayed perfectly black garments. Imagine paying extra money to look like someone attending an unusually formal dinner. Fashion has a wonderful sense of irony. Gold thread elevated clothing even further. Actual strands of precious metal woven into fabric. Not painted, real metal. Every movement caught candlelight. Every step quietly reminded observers that someone possessed astonishing resources. Naturally, kings adored the effect. Queens appreciated it too. Even bishops occasionally wore spectacular embroidered robes during important ceremonies. Religion often emphasized humility. Ceremony, however,
appreciated excellent tailoring, one of history's more interesting compromises. Now, picture entering a royal court. The room glows with hundreds of candles. Stone walls disappear beneath colourful tapestries. Musicians play softly somewhere beyond the crowd. Servants move carefully between groups carrying silver cups. Nobody rushes. Nobody shouts. Everything unfolds slowly, deliberately. Grace itself becomes part of the performance. Every noble present studies everyone else. Not obviously. That would be rude. Instead, they perform the timeless human skill of pretending not to observe, while secretly noticing absolutely everything. Who received new jewellery? Who wore outdated sleeves? Whose cloak looked suspiciously repaired? Who arrived wearing fur slightly too luxurious for their official rank? Court life functioned as one enormous fashion inspection. Failure rarely produced immediate disaster. Instead, it produced whispers. Sometimes whispers proved more dangerous. Sleeves deserve special attention. Modern clothing treats sleeves as practical necessities. Medieval fashion occasionally transformed them into engineering projects. Some sleeves hung almost to the floor. Others widened dramatically toward the wrists. Certain gowns featured detachable sleeves. Different colours appeared underneath outer garments. Layers multiplied. Movement itself became theatrical. Simply raising an arm required elegance or excellent planning. Imagine trying to eat soup while wearing fabric determined to visit the bowl before the spoon did. Life at court demanded patience. Buttons gradually became fashionable luxuries. Earlier garments relied heavily upon brooches, pins, laces, belts. As tailoring improved during the later Middle Ages, closely fitted clothing became increasingly popular. Rows of tiny buttons appeared, sometimes dozens of them. Fastening such garments required considerable time. Thankfully, wealthy households possessed servants. Otherwise, breakfast might begin around noon. Women's gowns evolved constantly. Necklines rose, then fell. Waists shifted, sleeves transformed, trains lengthened, fabrics grew richer. Fashion never remained still for very long. Every generation quietly informed the previous one that its clothing choices had been unfortunate. Sound familiar? One particularly dramatic accessory was the hennin. If you've ever seen illustrations of medieval ladies wearing tall, cone-shaped hats with flowing veils drifting behind them, you've met the hennin. These extraordinary hats appeared during the 15th century among wealthy women. Some reached impressive heights. Walking through narrow doorways suddenly required strategy. Imagine accidentally scraping your fashionable hat against a castle ceiling because elegance had become slightly overambitious. Not everyone approved. Moral writers complained. Artists mocked exaggerated styles. Older generations sighed heavily.
Young aristocrats ignored them. The eternal rhythm of fashion continued uninterrupted. Jewelry carried messages beyond decoration. Wedding rings symbolized marriage. Brooches displayed wealth. Necklaces incorporated precious stones believed to possess protective qualities. Rubies supposedly strengthened courage. Sapphires represented heavenly virtues. Emeralds enjoyed reputations for healing. Whether these beliefs
held scientific merit mattered less than the comfort they provided. Objects often carried emotional meaning. A gemstone could become family history worn around one's neck. Pearls became especially beloved. They symbolized purity, elegance, grace.
Paintings frequently depict noblewomen draped in pearls, sometimes genuine. Sometimes artistic imagination simply became enthusiastic. Artists occasionally improved reality. Portrait painters have always understood customer satisfaction. Let's quietly visit the tailor.
one of the busiest people in any prosperous town. Tailors occupied fascinating positions. They worked closely with wealthy clients, measured bodies, discussed fashion, adjusted expensive fabrics. A skilled tailor possessed remarkable influence. Poor workmanship ruined priceless cloth. Excellent craftsmanship transformed ordinary material into something unforgettable. Good tailors earned loyal customers. Probably also occasional impossible requests. No, my lord, adding another 12 inches to the sleeves will not improve mobility. Shoemakers enjoyed similar importance. Leather boots protected travellers. Soft slippers appeared indoors. Noble footwear displayed careful craftsmanship, decorative stitching, fine buckles, expensive leather. Earlier, we briefly encountered those famously long, pointed shoes. They truly deserve another visit. Known today as poulaines or krakows, these shoes became symbols of aristocratic extravagance. The longer the point, the more fashionable the owner appeared. Naturally, some ambitious individuals decided moderation sounded terribly unfashionable. Their shoe tips extended farther and farther. Eventually, walking became awkward. Certain wearers stuffed the points with moss or wool to maintain shape. Others tied the tips to their legs using small chains or cords. Imagine inventing footwear that actively required restraint to prevent tripping over itself. Human creativity remains endlessly entertaining. Some church officials
objected. They considered such shoes excessive. Vanity disguised as footwear. One preacher reportedly compared them unfavourably to the claws of demons. That seems slightly harsh, although admittedly they probably were difficult to ignore. Fur represented another powerful status symbol. Not all
Fur held equal prestige. Rabbit remained relatively common. Ermine became legendary. The white winter coat of the stoat, marked with tiny black tail tips, symbolized royalty and high nobility. Kings, queens, judges, powerful church leaders. Ermine lined magnificent ceremonial robes. Paintings immortalized its elegance. Seeing ermine instantly communicated authority.
Not surprisingly, laws sometimes restricted who could wear it. Which brings us to one of medieval Europe's favourite hobbies: passing laws about clothing. These were called sumptuary laws. Governments worried that merchants were becoming too wealthy. Successful townspeople purchased luxurious clothing. Soon they dressed almost like nobles. This caused considerable anxiety. If everyone looked rich, how could anyone immediately recognize who actually possessed noble blood? The solution seemed obvious. Write laws. Lots of them.
Certain fabrics became restricted, specific furs reserved, jewels limited, colours regulated, gold embroidery controlled. Simple enough, except people ignored the rules constantly. Some paid fines, others borrowed garments. Families inherited restricted clothing. Tailors discovered creative interpretations. Officials occasionally looked the other way. Fashion proved surprisingly difficult to regulate. History repeatedly demonstrates that telling people not to wear something often makes it considerably more desirable. Even kings struggled with this reality. Children of noble families learned these rules almost immediately. Young boys dressed in miniature versions of adult clothing. Little girls wore tiny gowns reflecting family status. Portraits occasionally make aristocratic children resemble remarkably serious middle-aged accountants. Tiny adults with elaborate sleeves. Modern childhood fashion had not yet arrived. Growing up involved practicing adulthood from an early age. Clothing prepared children for future responsibilities, or at least taught them extraordinary patience while someone adjusted 7 separate laces
One overlooked detail of medieval elegance involved movement. Beautiful clothing only achieved its full effect when worn gracefully. Etiquette books advised noble readers how to sit, stand, walk, bow, receive guests. Even laughter attracted commentary. Too loud suggested poor breeding. Too quiet seemed unfriendly. Everything required balance. Imagine spending years learning the correct angle for accepting a drinking cup. Court society transformed ordinary actions into carefully rehearsed rituals. Because appearance extended beyond fabric, the body itself became part of fashion. Pregnancy also influenced elite clothing in fascinating ways. Contrary to certain modern assumptions, medieval artists did not always hide pregnancy. Loose gowns could accommodate changing bodies. Some noble women continued appearing publicly while expecting children.
After all, producing heirs represented one of their most important dynastic responsibilities. There was little reason to pretend otherwise. Although fashion naturally adapted. Comfort, however, remained somewhat negotiable. A heavily embroidered velvet gown weighing several pounds was unlikely to qualify as relaxing. Still, beauty often required endurance. Another timeless tradition. Travel introduced practical challenges. Imagine crossing muddy roads in flowing robes. Rain threatened expensive dyes.
Dust settled everywhere. Servants travelled carrying spare clothing, brushes, protective coverings. Maintaining elegance required an entire support system. Royal appearance became teamwork. Behind every magnificently dressed queen stood dozens of people sewing, cleaning, repairing, packing, ironing, brushing, folding, and worrying about stains. History often remembers the crown. It forgets the laundresses. One final thought before we quietly leave the wardrobe behind. Modern fashion changes astonishingly fast. New trends appear every season. Medieval fashion moved more slowly. Yet when styles did change, people noticed. Young courtiers embraced fresh ideas eagerly. Older nobles grumbled. Writers complained that civilization itself might collapse because sleeves had become too wide. Civilizations, reassuringly, survived. Fashion simply marched onward, as it always has. So, the next time someone imagines medieval clothing as nothing more than dull brown tunics and shapeless cloaks, remember the reality. Remember the velvet, the silk, the embroidered gold, the towering hats, the pointed shoes, the impossible sleeves, the jewelled belts, the carefully chosen colours that quietly announced fortunes
without a single spoken word. Because beneath those castle roofs, beauty wasn't merely something people
admired. It was something they wore. Every morning, every feast, every royal wedding, every diplomatic meeting, every ordinary day, when extraordinary appearances quietly shaped first impressions. And soon we'll drift beyond clothing altogether into something even stranger. The medieval obsession with youth, marriage, aging, and the surprisingly complicated question of exactly when someone was considered beautiful, and when society quietly decided that beauty had already begun to fade.